During 1940 and 1941, Ship 16, the raider Atlantis, sunk 22 merchant ships before she herself was sunk by the Royal Navy. This is the story of the sinking of the Rabaul and able seaman Victor Ayres, who was aboard at the time. Victor Athol Ayres joined the Royal Australian Navy Reserve in 1934, following his brother into the service. He was an ordinary seaman until 1939, when he was mobilised and promoted to able seaman. He was sent for basic gunnery training to the Navy Depot Cerberus in Victoria. He qualified as a seaman gunner and was posted as a Dems gunner, a defensively equipped merchant ship gunner, onto a merchant ship, the motor vessel Rabaul, in April 1940. At this time, Rabaul was equipped with a 4-inch gun dating from World War I. The 4 to 6 Dems gunners on board were expected to defend the ship from particularly surface U-boats. Rabaul sailed mainly on the OB and SL convoys, sailing from Cardiff or Newport in the UK to Freetown. On some of these journeys she would continue on to Cape Town and then to Australia, returning back via the SL convoy series. In fact, these ships sailed independently without protection. Outbound convoys OB designated were dispersed about 700 miles from the UK and sailed independently. On this particular trip, OB 309, Rabaul was en route to Alexandria in the Middle East via Cape Town. Atlantis was well equipped and fast. She could make 19 knots and was carrying 6 6-inch guns, a 75mm gun on the bow, 4 torpedo tubes and an aircraft. Rabaul, on the other hand, carried 1 obsolete World War I vintage 4-inch guns and somewhere between 4 and 6 naval ratings. They had no chance. They couldn't fight and they couldn't run. Rabaul's sustained speed at that point was 9 knots. Rabaul was in the South Atlantic, 570 miles west-northwest of Walvis Bay, sailing towards Table Bay and then on to Alexandria. At about 1 a.m. on the 14th of May 1941, Atlantis sighted a darkened ship steaming south. It was Rabaul. Captain Rogge of the Atlantis, by his own account, made signals to Rabaul. Stop, stop, stop. Rabaul did not stop and did not alter course. Atlantis at this point illuminated Rabaul with their searchlight and then put a shot from the 75mm gun across their bows. At this point, F.T. Lewis, on the bridge of the Rabaul, turned the ship away, sped up in as much as they could, and Victor Ayres and the other naval ratings manned the gun. Atlantis now opened fire in earnest, pumping 21 shells into Rabaul at point-blank range. The first salvo set the ship afire, wounded able seaman Victor Ayres. The flames, fueled by burning oil spilling onto the deck, forced the crew up onto the deck from where they were hiding down below. At this point, several were hit by shrapnel, burnt by the flames. They took cover as such as they could find on the deck, but unfortunately several were then burnt by vials of acid which had been stored on the stern. It was at this point that able seaman Ayres, who had been wounded with a large piece of shrapnel right in the centre of his back, passed away in the lifeboat. He was comforted in his last moments by his friend Bruce Wharton, a member of the crew. Rabaul at this point was listing heavily. The crew managed to get one of the lifeboats into the water after Atlantis ceased fire. Many of the crew had to jump into the water directly. Able seaman Ayres was put into the lifeboat. The people in the water and in the boat thought they were goners. Their lifeboat was leaking. Their water casks were holed. The Germans moved their ship to shelter them. They lowered a boat to search for survivors and machine gun sharks to keep them away from the men in the water, incidentally wounding one of the crew. The remaining survivors were taken aboard Atlantis and well treated. Those who were wounded were cared for in the ship's hospital. The balance were eventually transferred to a German merchant ship, Dresden, and the war should have been over for them. However, fate had it that they were rescued by the Royal Navy off the coast of Spain with the cry of "The Navy's here." Unfortunately, this had a tragic outcome. Victor Ayres' colleague in the Navy, Fred Edgecock, also from Hobart, also aboard Rabaul, was rescued. A few months later, he was sent back as a Dems on a new ship, the Nottingham, which then sailed and was lost with all hands, sunk by a U-boat. It's a tragic story for all. Victor Ayres' family was devastated. We know this because of what they put into the newspapers on the anniversary of his death every year for many years after the war. Sailors like able seaman Ayres, doing their duty in their own small way, making their own contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic, through their combined efforts, brought victory in the Atlantic in 1943. This made possible the survival of Britain. This made possible the invasion of France. And they paid for it. They paid for it with 3,500 merchant ships lost. So it's hard to reconcile a personal tragedy for the family, a very, very small event, tiny event in the scale of the war, and yet cumulatively these small events added up to a massive victory for the Allies. And it's all due to men like able seaman Ayres.